Hello everyone. These are the samples that you'll be producing between weeks 4 and week 5. A closed slot seam, an open slot seam, and seam binding using double fold bias tape. Slot seams include a decorative slit formed by bringing two folds of fabric together and stitching them onto an underlying piece of fabric, where two top fabrics are touching at the fold. An open slot seam is where the two top fabrics are not touching at the fold. Slot seams are used to produce pockets, blouses, dresses, jackets, and coats. Double fold bias tape is a strip of fabric that is cut on the diagonal or the bias and generally used to enclose the raw edge. It can be used to eliminate the need for linings. Double fold bias tape is visible from the outside of the garment on the neckline, armhole, pocket, or hem. It is also used on accessories for home decor like table linens, quilts, etc., but can also be used to make button loops, drawstrings, and decorative applique. For the closed slot seam, I'll be using two pieces of fabric, both cut to 4 5/8 by 10 inches. We'll be stitching a line from the top to the bottom at 5/8 inch seam allowance. I'm going to iron my fabric seam allowances open. And pin the inset material directly to the back. With the closed slot seam sewn together and the accent fabric pinned, I'm going to put this underneath the presser foot. Using my seam ripper, I'm going to go through carefully and undo the basting stitches. This technique also works really handy when you're installing a zipper by sewing two panels together, placing that seam directly on the zipper, and top stitching the zipper down. For the open slot seam, I have two pieces of fabric. Each one is cut to 4 1/8 inch by 10 inches. I also have an inlay material which accounts for 5/8 inch seam allowance on each side with a 1 inch gap going through. This makes this fabric 2 1/4 inch by 10 inches long. I'm first going to sew the two pieces of fabric together using a machine basting stitch. I'm going to pin my inset material so the edge of the fabric is meeting the edge of the seam allowance on one side. With the open slot seam pinned and the two top layers already sewn together, I'm going to put this under the sewing machine. I'm going to be thoughtful as to how much of a seam allowance that I want from the gap to where I top stitch. In this case, I'm going to go for something like maybe an 1/8 inch to 3/16. With one side of the open slot seam stitched, I'm going to flip this over I'm going to fold over the accent fabric and iron it so I can visibly see the basting stitch that was placed along the seam. I'm then going to take the accent fabric and move it directly next to the seam allowance, where the two edges of the fabric meet. I'm then going to pin the fabric down This is what your backside should look like. The edge of the accent fabric is adjacent to the edge of the seam allowance. Now I'm going to top stitch down the other side with about the same distance from the original seam. Same as the closed slat seam, I'm going to use a seam ripper and open up the basting stitch where the two top fabrics meet. Take note how much this functions like a pleat. In some coats, you'll find an open slot seam in the back to accommodate more space, usually right below the yoke. I could stitch a shape in to secure this from opening up. That way the stitch is open and closed within the same seam. But for this sample, I'm going to open up the seam all the way through. For the swatch that we will be using the double fold bias tape in to do the seam binding, I encourage you to draw a round curve on opposite sides of the 8x10 fabric. That way you can explore integrating seam binding around a curve and also mitering a corner at a 90°. I'm going to use a CD as my reference to make a circle. Using your double fold bias tape, I wanted to highlight a couple things. If we look at the tape, we can see that it's folded over once and then it's folded over twice. Notice that one side is slightly narrower than the other side. We're going to open up the narrower side of the fold and pin that directly to the cloth. It's always important to pin your bias tape in a discrete area for practical application. I'm pinning the unfolded, narrower side of the bias tape directly to the top of the fabric. I'm going to pin this all the way around the sample, giving it a gap of maybe 2 to 3 inches between pinnings. When I get to the corner, I might pin a little more just because the curvature of the form. The great thing about bias tape is because the fabric is cut on a diagonal, it gives the strip of material a little bit more elasticity, which allows you to go around curves without too much puckering happening. When it gets to the corner, I'm going to pin it at a 45-degree angle. This is going to allow me to flip and redirect the bias tape so we can get a 90-degree angle. And I'm going to leave a little extra just so we can tuck one end into the other. And there you have it. The goal in stitching the double fold bias tape is that you place the stitch right at the fold line between the narrowest channel. When I get to the first mitered edge, I'm going to stop about 3/16 to 1/4 inch from the edge of the fabric. Then I'm going to leave the needle down so I can lift the presser foot and turn the fabric at a 90-degree angle. I moved any of the additional slack underneath the foot to the left. If all's good, you've stitched directly on the fold line, which allows you to fold it over, and then it should encase on front and back. I'm going to iron this down once I roll it over. Now keep in mind, when you get to areas like this, where there's a curve, a way to prevent this from curving in on itself is to give it a bunch of little cuts. Little V's. That way when the fabric comes together in the fold, there doesn't have extra slack that is taking up space and makes it pucker and look a little lumpy. When I get to the mitered corners, I'm going to snip off not the stitch, but across diagonal. So when those pieces come together, they're not creating extra bulk. You can see when those corners come together, at some point you're going to have to decide how you want the miter to go. You want it to be as clean as possible. So definitely like a 90-degree, 45-degree angle from the corner is what you want it to look like. Alright, I'm going to take this to an iron it down, and stitch it up. I'm going to iron the double fold bias tape down around the edge of my fabric. When it gets to the mitered corner, you're going to want to kind of think about how do you want that to overlap. I'll iron the first side flat and then go back and include like an angled miter and then iron that down just to secure it.